Late one night in Seoul, a ruthless Mafia chairman received a text meant for someone else. A plea for help sent by a child shivering behind a locked bathroom door. One forward reply later, the most dangerous man in the city became her only protector. Lee Tae-kwon is a man of ice, ruling a criminal empire where mercy is a liability and silence is a weapon. He lives in a world of high-rise glass and cold calculations, far removed from the desperate cries of the streets. But when a little girl named Era sends a message intended for a savior she doesn't have, the vibration of Tae-kwon's phone shatters his composure. The words on the screen drag him back to a dark basement in Busan and a brother he couldn't save. Tonight, Tae-kwon isn't moving to secure a territory or settle a debt. He is racing against the clock to keep a promise made 30 years ago. He is no longer just a chairman. He is the shadow guardian of a girl who has officially run out of time. The 64th floor of the Lotte World Tower didn't feel like an office. It felt like an altar to absolute control. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Seoul was a glittering map of neon veins and restless movement. But inside Lee Tae-kwon's sanctuary, the air was still and pressurized. Tae-kwon sat motionless behind a desk of polished obsidian, the city's lights reflecting off his sharp features like ice. At 40, his face was a mask of calculated indifference, a masterclass in professional detachment that had earned him the name the Iron Architect of the Konghwa Syndicate. Below him, millions of lives pulsed with messy emotions. Love, fear, hope. But Tae-kwon had long ago purged those luxuries from his own existence. To him, the city was merely a series of numbers, territories, and liabilities. He didn't see people. He saw assets to be moved or obstacles to be cleared. Beside him, a crystal glass of whiskey sat untouched, the ice having melted hours ago. He didn't drink to relax. He didn't know how. Relaxation was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. The men who stood at the periphery of the room, his top lieutenants, didn't dare speak. They watched the back of his expensive silk suit, waiting for a nod or a word that could shift the fate of the city's docks or dismantle a rival's influence by dawn. Tae-kwon was surrounded by power, yet he was profoundly alone. He had built an empire of glass and steel to ensure that no one could ever get close enough to see the hollow space where a heart used to be. His life was a meticulously maintained machine of routine and cold authority. He had convinced himself that the silence of his high-rise was peace, and that his emotional void was strength. He believed he had finally succeeded in burying the boy from Busan who once knew the taste of salt and terror. But as he stared out at the sprawling darkness, his personal phone, the one reserved only for the highest level of emergency, gave a soft, sharp vibration against the obsidian desk. He didn't move at first. He expected a report of a warehouse raid or a political betrayal. Instead, the blue light of the screen illuminated the cold lines of his face, revealing a message from an unknown number. He locked me in the bathroom. I'm scared. In that moment, the 64 floors of distance between Tae-kwon and the world vanished. The silence of the office was suddenly deafening, and for the first time in 23 years, the Iron Architect felt a crack in his foundation. The hollow space wasn't empty anymore. It was beginning to burn. The blue glow of the phone screen didn't just illuminate the darkened office. It acted as a tear in the fabric of time, dragging Tae-kwon down from his ivory tower and into the damp, salt-heavy air of Busan, 30 years in the past. Before the silk suits and the obsidian desks, there was the basement. It was a cramped, windowless concrete box that smelled of mildew and cheap soju. In that memory, Tae-kwon was not a chairman. He was merely Gwon-hee, a 6-year-old boy whose entire world was the size of the space beneath a rusted metal sink. He could still feel the cold press of the pipes against his neck and the jagged edge of a cleaning bucket digging into his hip. Beside him, his older brother, Tae-hoon, held him with a grip that was both a shield and a prayer. Outside the thin cabinet doors, the world was a cacophony of shattering glass and the heavy, rhythmic thud of their father's boots. Don't breathe, Gwon-hee. Taehoon had whispered, his voice barely a vibration against the younger boy's ear. If you don't make a sound, the monster can't find us. But the monster always found them. When the cabinet doors were ripped open, it wasn't Taegwon who was pulled out. Taehoon, only 10 years old but already possessing the soul of a guardian, had thrown himself forward, taking up all the space, making himself the only target. Taegwon had watched through the sliver of the remaining door, paralyzed as his brother became a human shield. The beating that night had been different from the others. Longer, louder, fueled by a rage that seemed bottomless. Taehoon hadn't cried out once. He had only looked back at the sink, his eyes locking onto the dark gap where his brother hid, pleading with his silence for Taegwon to stay put. By the time the boots stopped thudding and the front door slammed shut, the basement had grown deathly quiet. Taegwon had crawled out, his hands trembling as he reached for his brother. Taehoon lay on the cold concrete, his face a map of bruises, his breathing shallow and rattling like stones in a tin can. I kept you safe. Taehoon had wheezed, his eyes unfocused as they drifted toward the water-stained ceiling. Taegwon had waited for his brother to wake up, for the rattling to stop, for the morning light to bring a miracle. But the miracle never came. In the gray dawn of that Busan basement, the rattling simply ceased. Taehoon stopped breathing, leaving behind a silence so heavy it had followed Taegwon for 3 decades. Now, in the silence of his soul high-rise, that same heavy air returned. Taegwon looked at the phone, at the words, "I'm scared," and felt the ghost of his brother's hand on his shoulder. The Iron Architect was gone. Only a brother remained. In the wake of the funeral, a hollow ceremony paid for by the city and attended by no one, the boy who was once Gwonhee stood on the edge of the Busan harbor. The air was thick with the scent of salt and industrial grease, a bitter perfume that signaled the end of his childhood. He looked down at his small, scarred hands, the skin still stained with the dust of the basement, and felt a coldness settle into his bones that no summer sun could ever melt. He realized then that his brother hadn't just died. He had been sacrificed to a world that only respected the fist and the blade. Taehoon had been kind, and kindness had left him broken on a concrete floor. Taehoon had been protective, and protection had cost him his life. To the young Gwonhee, the lesson was as sharp as a razor. In this life, the only way to shield the things you loved was to become the very thing everyone else feared. "I won't be like you," he whispered to the crashing waves, though the words weren't an insult to his brother's memory, but a solemn vow to his ghost. "I will never be small. I will never hide under a sink again." He decided that day to kill the boy named Gwonhee before someone else could do it for him. He would build a shell so thick and an empire so vast that no man would ever dare raise a hand in his presence. He would become the architect of his own destiny, carving a path through the underworld until he sat so high that the screams from the basements of the world could no longer reach him. He walked away from the harbor and into the shadows of the city's neon-lit alleys, leaving his birth name behind like a discarded skin. He sought out the men who dealt in power and pain, offering them the only thing he had left, a heart that had forgotten how to flinch. He climbed the ranks of the Konghwa syndicate not with desperation, but with a clinical, terrifying focus. Every deal struck, every rival silenced, and every won territory was a brick in the fortress he was building around his soul. For 30 years, Lee Taegwon believed he had succeeded. He believed the vow was fulfilled and the debt to his brother was paid in the currency of his own coldness. But as he stood in his soul high-rise, gripping the phone that pulsed with Era's terror, he realized the vow was incomplete. He had become the man with the power, but he had forgotten why he wanted it. The armor was finally complete, but the little girl in the bathroom was the final piece of a promise he had made to a dead boy 3 decades ago. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a weapon finally being drawn for its true purpose. The silence in the penthouse was shattered not by a shout, but by the sharp, metallic snap of Taegwon's suit jacket being pulled tight. His movements were fluid, stripped of their usual executive grace and replaced by a predatory urgency. His lieutenants stepped forward, their shadows lengthening across the obsidian floor, confusion masking their disciplined faces. "Chairman? The shipment at the Incheon docks. We need your authorization," his second-in-command ventured, stepping into his path. Tae-gwon didn't even look at him. He bypassed the men as if they were ghosts, his eyes fixed on the elevator doors. "Cancel it," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated in the still air. "Cancel everything. Nobody follows me. If a single black sedan leaves this garage behind mine, consider it an act of treason." The elevator descent was a blur of steel and light. When the doors opened into the subterranean garage, Tae-gwon ignored his usual armored limousine and the professional driver standing at attention. Instead, he headed for the matte black sports car kept in the corner, a machine built for speed and anonymity. The engine roared to life, a guttural snarl that echoed off the concrete walls like a war cry. He tore out of the building, the tires screaming against the pavement as he pivoted onto the main artery of the city. Seoul at night was a labyrinth of light, but Tae-gwon saw only the glowing coordinates on his dashboard, a digital heartbeat pulsing in the center of the map. He drove with a clinical ferocity, weaving through the late-night traffic of Gangnam with the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. The wind whipped past the windows, but inside the cabin, the silence had returned. Not the cold silence of the high-rise, but the suffocating silence of the Busan basement. With every kilometer he covered, the decades of armor he had meticulously built began to feel heavy, restrictive, and false. He was shedding the chairman with every red light he ignored, reaching back for the brother he had buried. The GPS led him away from the glass towers and into a crumbling residential district where the streetlights flickered and the neon signs were broken. This was a place of peeling paint and narrow alleys, a place where screams were often ignored and doors stayed locked. As the car screeched to a halt in front of a shadowed apartment complex, Tae-gwon's hand hovered over the door handle. His heart, a stone for 30 years, was hammering against his ribs. He checked the phone one last time. There were no new messages. "Stay quiet," he whispered to the empty car, his eyes narrowing as he looked at a darkened third-story window. "I'm here." He stepped out into the humid night air, the silence of the street absolute, save for the faint, terrifying sound of wood splintering in the distance. The hunt had begun. The stairwell of the apartment complex was a narrow throat of peeling wallpaper and the smell of stale cooking oil. Tae-gwon moved up the concrete steps with the silence of a ghost, his polished shoes making no sound against the grit. On the third floor, the hallway light flickered with a dying buzz, casting long, jagged shadows that danced like specters against the doors. He didn't need to check the numbers. The sound of a man's voice, thick with liquor and a jagged, ugly rage, guided him. Then came the sound that made Tae-gwon's jaw lock, the sharp, rhythmic crack of shoulder meeting wood. Tae-gwon reached the door of 3B. It was already hanging by a single hinge, the frame splintered from repeated blows. Inside, the apartment was a wreckage of overturned chairs and shattered glass. A man stood in the hallway, his back to the entrance, his massive frame heaving with effort as he kicked at the flimsy bathroom door. "Open it, you little brat," the man roared, his voice cracking. "You think a lock is going to stop me?" The wood groaned, a long fissure snaking down the center of the panel. From behind the door, Tae-gwon heard a sound that didn't belong in a civilized world. A small, high-pitched whimper, the sound of a trapped animal waiting for the end. It was the exact sound Gwon-hee had made under the sink in Busan. The man raised his boot for the final blow, his fingers curling into the gap of the splintering wood, reaching through to grab whatever he could find. "I told you," Tae-gwon said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying calm that cut through the father's drunken shouting like a razor through silk. "Stay quiet." The man froze, his hand still hooked into the broken door. He turned slowly, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, taking in the sight of the stranger standing in his living room. Tae-gwon looked out of place in the squalor, his tailored suit and pristine white shirt a stark contrast to the filth of the room. But it was his eyes that stopped the man's breath. They were as cold and empty as the barrel of a gun. "Who the hell are you?" the father spat, trying to summon a bravado that was quickly leaking out of him. Tae-gwon didn't answer. He didn't need a name. He was the personification of every consequence the man had ever tried to outrun. He stepped over a broken bottle, his movement so controlled it was almost beautiful. "The girl is mine," Tae-gwon said. The words a decree from a throne the father couldn't even imagine. As the man lunged forward with a primitive growl, Tae-gwon didn't flinch. He simply moved into the space, the chairman of Seoul's underworld finally meeting the monster of his childhood. The bathroom door stayed shut, but the nightmare outside of it was about to end. The father's lunge was clumsy, a chaotic explosion of drunken desperation that Tae-gwon met with the surgical precision of a predator. He didn't use more effort than was necessary. As the man's fist swung wide, Tae-gwon stepped inside the arc, his hand flashing out like a strike of lightning. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the hallway as he drove his palm into the bridge of the man's nose, followed instantly by a knee to the solar plexus that folded the giant in half. The man hit the floor with a heavy thud, his breath escaping in a ragged wheeze. He tried to scramble up, but Tae-gwon's foot was already there, pressing down on his chest with the weight of an entire empire. The chairman didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was infinitely more terrifying. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a clean, white silk handkerchief, slowly wiping a speck of the man's blood from his cuff. "You like to break things that are smaller than you," Tae-gwon said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to chill the very air in the room. "You like the sound of doors splintering because it makes you feel powerful. But you are nothing. You are a mistake I am about to erase." The man looked up, his vision blurring, seeing for the first time the sheer scale of the shadow he had accidentally stepped into. This wasn't a police officer bound by laws or a neighbor who would call for help. This was a man who owned the shadows themselves. "Please," the father gasped, the bravado finally replaced by the raw, pathetic terror of a coward unmasked. Tae-gwon leaned down, his face inches from the man's. "You have 24 hours to leave Seoul. If I ever see your shadow on a wall in this city, if I even hear your name whispered in a gutter, I will not send men to find you. I will come myself. And I promise you, what I did to this door will be mercy compared to what I do to you." He removed his foot and stood straight, his silhouette towering over the broken man. "The city is mine. Every street, every alley, every light you see. And from this moment on, that girl and her mother are part of my city. They are under my sky. Run while you still have legs to carry you." The man didn't wait. He scrambled toward the exit, stumbling over his own feet, leaving a trail of blood and fear behind him. Tae-gwon watched him go, his expression unchanging, until the sound of the man's frantic footsteps faded into the night. The silence returned, but it was different now. The air in the apartment felt lighter, the suffocating tension of the violence replaced by a strange, heavy peace. Tae-gwon turned back to the splintered bathroom door. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not from the fight, but from the weight of the moment. "Era," he said, his voice losing its edge, softening into something he hadn't used since Busan. "The monster is gone. You can come out now." The violent echo of the father's departure was replaced by a heavy, clinical silence. Tae-gwon did not step toward the bathroom yet. His eyes were fixed on the woman slumped against the kitchen cabinets. Era's mother was conscious but pale, her breathing shallow as she clutched a bruised side, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and bewilderment at the savior who looked like a reaper. Tae-gwon knew that a call to the authorities would bring sirens, flashing lights, and a cold bureaucracy that would tear this fragile family apart before it could heal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact that appeared as a simple string of digits. "Dr. Han," Taegwon said when the line connected, his voice regaining its boardroom authority. "I have a residential address in the Mapo district. Internal bruising, possible rib fractures, and severe facial trauma. Bring everything. You were never here, and this never happened." The man on the other end didn't ask questions. In the underworld, Dr. Han was the ghost who stitched together the wounds that couldn't be explained to the police. He was the shadow physician of the Konghwa Syndicate, a man who traded his medical ethics for the chairman's gold and protection. Within 15 minutes, the discreet purr of a silver sedan reached the street below. Taegwon stood by the window, watching as a slender man carrying a heavy leather case hurried into the building. When the doctor entered the apartment, he didn't flinch at the shattered furniture or the blood on the floor. He simply nodded to Taegwon and knelt beside the woman, his hands moving with practiced, silent efficiency. "She'll live," Han murmured after a few moments, checking her pupils. "No internal bleeding, but she needs rest and quiet. I'll administer a sedative and leave the necessary supplies." Taegwon watched the process from the shadows of the hallway, his silhouette tall and unmoving. He was paying for silence as much as for healing. By using his own resources, he was ensuring that no social worker would file a report and no police officer would ask why a mafia boss was standing in a ruined living room at 2 in the morning. He was wrapping the family in the same protective shroud that usually hid his crimes. As the doctor worked, Taegwon turned his gaze back to the bathroom door. The medical crisis was being handled by a professional, but the emotional one required something the chairman hadn't practiced in decades. He realized that while Dr. Han could mend the mother's ribs, only he could reach the child still hiding behind the splintered wood. For the first time, the man who controlled the city felt the true weight of his power, not as a weapon of fear, but as a shield for the silent. Taegwon approached the bathroom door, but he didn't try to force it open. He knew that to a child who had just heard the sounds of a struggle, any sudden movement was a threat. Instead, he slowly lowered himself, his expensive suit trousers creasing as he sat on the cold, linoleum floor with his back against the splintered wood. He didn't look like a chairman now. He looked like a man seeking shelter. "Era," he said softly, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. "My name is Matt. I'm the one you texted." Silence followed, heavy and thick, until a small, trembling voice drifted through the cracks in the wood. "Is the monster gone?" "He's gone," Taegwon promised, his eyes tracking the shadows on the wall. "He can never come back here. I've made sure of it." He paused, searching for the words to bridge the 30-year gap in his heart. "You know, Era, when I was exactly your age, I had a bathroom just like this, and I was just as scared as you are." He heard a soft rustle from the other side, the sound of a child moving closer to the door. "I had a brother," Taegwon continued, his voice thick with a vulnerability he hadn't felt since Busan. "His name was Taehoon. He was the bravest person I ever knew. When things got bad, he would tell me stories to keep the fear away. He told me that one day, I would grow up to be someone who could make the world quiet. Someone who could stop the monsters." He leaned his head back against the door, closing his eyes. "I spent a long time forgetting that promise. I thought being strong meant being cold. I thought if I didn't feel anything, nothing could hurt me. But tonight, when I got your message, I realized that Taehoon didn't save me just so I could be rich or powerful. He saved me so I could be here, outside this door, for you." A small thud hit the door, the sound of Era leaning her own back against the wood, mimicking him. They were two strangers separated by an inch of broken pine, connected by a shared history of shadows. "He was my hero," Taegwon whispered, "and tonight you were mine. You reached out when it was dark, and you reminded me who I was supposed to be." The lock clicked. It was a tiny, metallic sound that felt louder than the engine of his car or the roar of his lieutenants. The door creaked open just a few inches. A single, wide eye, red from crying, peered out at him. Taegwon didn't move. He stayed on the floor, making himself small, showing her that for the first time in his life, his power was not a weapon, but a gift. "Hi, Era," he said, offering a small, tired smile. "I'm glad you stayed quiet. I'm here now." 6 months later, the early morning sun over Seoul didn't feel as cold as it once had. In a quiet, middle-class neighborhood far removed from the crumbling apartment where the shadows had once lived, Kim Era stepped out of her new home. She wore a crisp school uniform, her hair neatly braided, and her eyes bright with a peace that had been hard-won. In her hand, she clutched a letter that had arrived the day before. A full scholarship to the city's most prestigious academy, granted by an anonymous foundation whose logo was a simple, stylized shield. Her mother stood in the doorway, looking healthy and vibrant, waving goodbye with a hand that no longer trembled. They didn't know the name of the man who had facilitated the move, nor did they know why their medical bills had vanished or why the local shops refused to take their money. To them, it was a series of miracles. To the rest of the city, it was the silent will of the chairman. As Era walked toward the bus stop, a matte black sedan sat idling at the corner, its windows tinted deep enough to hide the world within. Inside, Lee Taegwon sat in the back seat, a tablet of territory reports resting unread on his lap. He wasn't looking at the numbers today. He was watching the girl. His lieutenants no longer questioned these morning detours. They had learned that the chairman's business now included the invisible perimeter around this specific school route. The syndicate had changed. The men had seen the shift in Taegwon's eyes, a lethal focus that was now anchored by a sense of purpose. He was still the Iron Architect, but he was no longer building a fortress to keep the world out. He was building a sanctuary to keep the innocent in. Taegwon watched through the glass as Era laughed with a friend, her steps light and unafraid. He reached into his pocket and touched his phone, the one he had never replaced. He often looked at the archive thread, the desperate texts that had acted as the final bridge to his brother's memory. He realized now that Taehoon hadn't died just to leave him with a legacy of pain. He had died to teach him that power is only a burden until it is used to protect a child's right to be small. The girl reached the school gates and paused, looking toward the black sedan as if sensing a familiar presence. She didn't see him, but she smiled, a bright, knowing expression, before disappearing inside. Taegwon felt a warmth settle in his chest, a sensation that had once been as foreign to him as the Busan Sea was to the Seoul sky. "Drive," he commanded softly. The car pulled away, merging into the flow of the city. The chairman returned to his high-rise, but as he looked out over the glass and steel of his empire, he finally felt at peace. The basement was empty. The monster was gone. And for the first time in 30 years, the silence in the room wasn't lonely. It was a promise kept.